There is a word you use constantly, in a language spoken by billions of people, that is secretly the name of an island. Copper. The metal in the wire running through the walls of your house, in the coins in your pocket, in the pipes carrying water beneath your feet. In English, in Portuguese, in Spanish, in French, in dozens of languages descended from Latin. The word for this metal traces back to a single Latin phrase, as Cyprium, the metal of Cyprus. Not the reddish metal, not the malleable metal. The metal that belonged, in the ancient world's imagination, to one specific island in the eastern Mediterranean. Somewhere along the way, the place name simply became the thing itself. Cyprium became Cuprum. Cuprum became copper. No other island in human history has had this happen to it. No one calls gold the metal of Nubia, even though Nubian gold financed the pharaohs of Egypt for 1,000 years. No one calls silver the metal of Potosi, even though a single Andean mountain funded the Spanish Empire for 2 centuries. But copper carries Cyprus inside its own name, permanently, in nearly every European language. Because for more than 2,000 years, this small island in the Mediterranean was not just a producer of copper. It was, as far as the ancient world was concerned, close to being the source of copper itself. This is the story of how one island's mountains became the industrial engine of the entire Bronze Age, and how the metal pulled from those mountains helped build, arm, and ultimately doom some of the earliest great civilizations on Earth. To understand why Cyprus mattered so much, you first have to understand what bronze actually did for the ancient world, and why it took a very specific combination of geography and geology for any civilization to get its hands on it. Bronze is not a metal you find in the ground. It is an alloy. Copper mixed deliberately with a small amount of tin, usually in a ratio of roughly 10 parts copper to 1 part tin. And the resulting mixture is dramatically harder, sharper, and more durable than either metal alone. A society that could reliably produce bronze could produce better weapons, better armor, better tools, better farming implements than a society still working in stone or soft native copper. Bronze was, in the most literal sense, the technology that separated the Bronze Age from everything that came before it. But making bronze required something almost no single region possessed on its own: abundant copper and abundant tin, both in the same place. Tin deposits in the ancient Near East were scattered and scarce. Some historians believe much of the ancient world's tin traveled enormous distances, possibly from as far away as Afghanistan or even the British Isles, carried along trade networks that stretched across thousands of kilometers. Copper, by contrast, could be found in a genuinely productive quantity in only a handful of locations across the entire Mediterranean and Near East. And of those locations, one stood far above the rest in richness, accessibility, and sheer output. The northern slopes of the Troodos Mountains in the western part of Cyprus sit on top of something geologists call an ophiolite, a slab of ancient oceanic crust that was thrust up onto dry land by tectonic forces millions of years ago, dragging with it mineral deposits that would normally sit far below the ocean floor, permanently out of reach. That geological accident left copper-bearing ore scattered across the mountainside, in places rich enough that early humans could simply find raw, native copper lying exposed on the surface of the earth, no mining required. Archaeologists have traced Cypriot copper objects back to roughly 4000 BC, tools hammered directly out of surface nuggets, made without ever heating or melting the metal at all. Around 2500 BC, something changed. Cypriot metalworkers figured out how to smelt copper ore, heating crushed rock in furnaces hot enough to separate pure metal from stone, unlocking a vastly larger supply than surface nuggets alone could ever provide. A few centuries after that, they began deliberately alloying that copper with imported tin, and true Cypriot bronze started flowing outward across the Mediterranean world. By the height of the Late Bronze Age, roughly the 15th through 11th centuries BC, Cyprus had transformed from a modest island of farmers and fishermen into what modern archaeologists sometimes call, without much exaggeration, a civilization of copper, an entire political and economic order built, quite literally, on rock. Picture the city of Enkomi during this period, on the eastern coast of Cyprus, close to where the copper ore came down from the mountains to meet the sea. The air near the workshops would have carried a constant haze of charcoal smoke and the mineral tang of hot slag. Furnaces burned around the clock, fed by bellows worked in shifts, the glow visible after dark across the low rooftops of the city. Crushed ore and charcoal went in one end, refined copper ingots cast into a distinctive shape resembling a stretched animal hide. Historians still debate exactly why that shape became standard, though it may simply have been an efficient form for handling, stacking, and shipping. Came out the other, cooling on stone floors before being carried down to the harbor. Workshops around the furnaces turned raw ingots into finished tripods, bowls, weapons, and ornamental bronze pieces so refined that archaeologists working the eastern Mediterranean often struggled to distinguish genuine Cypriot bronze work from pieces made anywhere else in the region, a sign of just how thoroughly Cypriot metallurgical technique had spread and been copied by neighboring cultures. Modern excavation at sites near Enkomi has recovered more than a ton of copper slag and discarded ore from the workshop districts alone, along with half-finished bronze objects that had been set aside for recycling. Direct physical evidence of an industry running at genuinely industrial intensity, not the scattered work of a handful of independent smiths. And the demand for what Cyprus produced was not local. It was international. In every sense, the Bronze Age world understood that term. Cyprus sat almost perfectly at the crossroads of the eastern Mediterranean trade networks, a little over 70 kilometers from the coast of Anatolia to the north, roughly 60 kilometers from the Levantine coast to the east, several hundred kilometers north of Egypt, and a comparable distance east of Crete. Any merchant ship moving between the great palace civilizations of the Bronze Age, Egyptian pharaohs, Hittite kings in Anatolia, Mycenaean palace states in Greece, the trading cities of the Levantine coast, was likely to pass within sight of Cyprus at some point in the voyage. The island didn't need to chase its customers. Its customers sailed past its door as a matter of geography. Ancient diplomatic archives make this trade relationship almost embarrassingly concrete. Clay tablets recovered from the Egyptian Royal Archive at Amarna, dating to the 14th century BC, preserve an entire correspondence between Egyptian pharaohs and the king of a place called Al-Ashia, a kingdom most historians now identify as Cyprus itself, or at least its principal copper-producing polity. These letters were written in cuneiform script, pressed into wet clay, and read almost like ordinary diplomatic emails would today, if emails were fired in a kiln and buried for 3,000 years. In one letter, the king of Al-Ashia apologizes for a plague that has struck his kingdom's copper workers and slowed production, promising the pharaoh that shipments will resume once the crisis passes. In others, both kings haggle over quantities, discuss shipments of copper measured in talents, a standard unit of weight used across the Bronze Age world specifically for large shipments of metal, and request gifts in return, including silver, ivory, and even, in one letter, an Egyptian physician sent to help treat illness in the Cypriot royal household. This is not myth, poetry, or archaeological inference stitched together from fragments. This is a direct written record of a Bronze Age king explaining, to the most powerful ruler in the ancient world, why his copper exports were running late. The physical evidence backs up exactly what those letters describe, in astonishing detail. In 1982, a sponge diver working off the southern coast of Anatolia, near a headland called Uluburun, spotted an unusual shape on the sea floor roughly 44 meters down. It turned out to be the oldest and most completely preserved Bronze Age shipwreck ever found. A merchant vessel that had gone down sometime in the late 14th century BC. Its hull collapsed, but its cargo preserved almost exactly where it had settled for well over 3,000 years. Marine archaeologists spent more than a decade excavating the site, dive by dive. And what they recovered amounted to a snapshot of the entire Bronze Age trading world in a single hold. Roughly 10 tons of copper ingots cast in that distinctive hide shape, stacked in neat rows exactly as they had been loaded. A ton of tin ingots to go with them, enough to produce a substantial quantity of true bronze once blended in the correct ratio. Blocks of raw glass, elephant and hippopotamus ivory, ostrich eggshells, Baltic amber, Egyptian jewelry, Mycenaean pottery, and even a folding wooden writing board, one of the oldest ever discovered. Most of that copper is believed, based on lead isotope analysis matching the ore to specific geological source regions, to have originated from Cypriot mines. 10 tons of copper on a single ship, alongside cargo drawn from at least 7 different cultures spanning the length of the Mediterranean and beyond, gives some sense of just how organized, heavy, and genuinely international this trade had become. Not scattered local exchange between neighboring villages, but coordinated bulk shipping of a strategic resource, more than 3,000 years before the word globalization existed to describe it. Control over that resource became, inevitably, control over political power on the island itself. In the earliest period of Cyprus's Bronze Age prosperity, the copper trade was relatively decentralized, competing merchant towns and local elites, each managing their own mines, furnaces, and trade contacts, occasionally clashing over territory, or accusing rival smiths of raiding each other's workshops. Over time, that fragmented system consolidated into something more centralized, a network of city kingdoms, each ruled by its own king, each deriving much of its wealth and legitimacy from control over copper production and export. Kingship on Cyprus in this period was inseparable from metallurgy. A king who controlled productive mines and skilled smiths controlled trade relationships with Egypt, with the Hittites, with the Mycenaeans, and trade relationships in the Bronze Age were also alliances, marriages, and buffers against invasion. By the end of the Bronze Age, Cyprus was home to a cluster of these independent city kingdoms scattered around its coastline: Salamis, Kition, Paphos, and others, each controlling its own stretch of harbor and, crucially, its own access route inland toward the copper-bearing slopes of the Troodos Range. Rivalry between them was constant. Control of a productive mining district or a key mountain pass could shift a kingdom's fortunes for a generation, and accusations of raided workshops or poached smiths appear in what fragmentary records survive, suggesting that skilled metalworkers themselves were valuable enough to be worth fighting over, not just the raw ore they worked with. That wealth built more than palaces. It built temples, monumental architecture, sophisticated writing systems adapted for Cypriot use, and an artistic tradition confident enough to influence metalworking styles across the entire eastern Mediterranean. For roughly 4 centuries, Cyprus was not a peripheral island on the edge of the ancient world's great civilizations. It was one of the load-bearing pillars underneath them. Then, in the span of little more than a generation, the entire interconnected Bronze Age world collapsed. Historians still argue fiercely about exactly what caused the sweeping crisis that struck the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 to 1150 BC. A combination of factors is generally blamed, including climate change and prolonged drought, internal political breakdowns, and waves of displaced raiders and migrants that Egyptian records call, ominously, the Sea Peoples. Whatever the precise mixture of causes, the results were catastrophic and remarkably synchronized. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia disintegrated entirely. Mycenaean palace states across mainland Greece were destroyed, one after another, and never rebuilt at the same scale. Major trading cities along the Levantine coast were burned. The tightly woven international trade network that had carried Cypriot copper to every corner of the Bronze Age world simply stopped existing, almost all at once. Cyprus itself was not spared. Enkomi and other coastal centers suffered destruction layers that archaeologists can still read today in the burned soil and collapsed walls. Evidence of raids or warfare severe enough to end centuries of continuous occupation almost overnight in some districts. Egyptian temple inscriptions from this period describe waves of seaborne raiders sweeping through the eastern Mediterranean, destroying everything in their path. An account that lines up disturbingly well with the archaeological destruction layers found not just on Cyprus, but at nearly every major Bronze Age port site across the region, from Ugarit on the Levantine coast to the palace centers of mainland Greece. But Cyprus's relationship with copper proved more durable than any single Bronze Age kingdom that had grown wealthy from it. As the old palace economies collapsed and the old trade networks fractured, the island adapted rather than disappeared. Refugees from the collapsing Mycenaean world are believed to have resettled parts of Cyprus in this period, bringing their own traditions with them, even as they adopted the island's existing metallurgical expertise. The furnaces that had gone cold in the destruction were, in many places, eventually relit. Copper production continued in altered form, even as the world around it fundamentally changed. Smaller in scale than the palace-driven exports of the late Bronze Age, but never fully extinguished. What began as a Bronze Age export, good remained, across the transition into the Iron Age and beyond, one of the defining resources of the entire Mediterranean. That continuity is exactly why, centuries later, Cyprus's copper reputation was still strong enough to name the metal itself in the language of an empire that hadn't even existed during the island's Bronze Age peak. Between the fall of the Bronze Age palaces and the rise of Rome, Cyprus passed under Assyrian, Egyptian, and Persian influence in turn, then briefly into the Hellenistic world following Alexander's conquests, and finally under the control of Ptolemaic Egypt, which appointed its own governor specifically to oversee the island's mines. By the time Rome absorbed Cyprus outright, the island had already been mining copper for well over 2,000 years, and Roman writers simply inherited a reputation that predated their entire civilization by millennia. Roman control over Cypriot mines was systematic and highly organized. Contractors operating under a Roman procurator extracted copper at industrial scale, feeding coinage stamped with the emperor's image, the elaborate plumbing systems that carried water through Roman cities and public baths, structural fittings in monumental architecture, and weaponry across an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. The Roman geographer Strabo, writing in the 1st century BC, specifically singled out the mines near a Cypriot town called Tamassos as among the most important copper sources in the entire empire, a detail that survives because Strabo's own geographic writings happened to be preserved and copied across the centuries that followed. And it was in this Roman period that the phrase sais Cyprium, quite literally Cyprian ore, or metal of Cyprus, hardened into common usage across the Latin-speaking world, eventually contracting into the single word Cuprum, the direct ancestor of copper in English and equivalent words across most of Europe. Think about the strangeness of that linguistic fact for a moment. The Bronze Age kingdoms that first built Cyprus's copper reputation were gone 1,000 years before Rome ever adopted the phrase. The Hittites who once negotiated for Cypriot metal no longer existed as a civilization. The Mycenaean palaces that once imported it lay in ruins, rediscovered only by archaeologists 3,000 years later. And still, the name stuck, carried forward not through any single continuous political entity, but through the metal itself, moving from hand to hand, language to language, empire to empire, always trailing the same geographic memory behind it. The mining never really stopped, even as empires rose and fell around the island. Cyprus passed from Roman control to Byzantine rule, then through Crusader kingdoms, Venetian administration, centuries of Ottoman rule, and eventually British colonial control beginning in 1878. And in nearly every one of those periods, someone, somewhere on the island, was still pulling copper out of the Troodos foothills in some form. By the 20th century, industrial mining companies were reworking sites that had first been opened in the Bronze Age, sometimes literally digging through the massive ancient slag heaps left behind by smelters that had gone cold 3,000 years earlier, extracting the small residual traces of copper those ancient furnaces hadn't been efficient enough to fully capture. The island's relationship with this metal ran deep enough to shape its mythology as well as its economy. In Greek tradition, Cyprus was the birthplace of Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, said to have emerged from the sea foam near the island's southwestern coast. The Greeks associated her closely with the island's defining metal, polished copper and bronze mirrors, prized across the ancient world for their reflective shine before glass mirrors existed, were considered instruments of beauty and seduction, and the metal itself carried associations with luster, desirability, and value that fed directly back into the goddess's own mythology. Whether the goddess was named for the island's fame, or the island's fame reinforced the goddess's cult, is impossible to fully untangle at this historical distance. But the two were bound together in the ancient imagination in a way few other places and deities were. A metal, a myth, and an island's entire identity, all fused into a single reputation that outlasted the empires that believed in that goddess by well over 1,000 years. The mining itself never fully stopped across all those intervening centuries. Through Byzantine rule, Crusader kingdoms, Venetian administration, and nearly 400 years of Ottoman control, though its intensity rose and fell with each era's technology and appetite for metal. It was under British colonial administration, beginning in 1878, that Cypriot copper mining was re-industrialized at a scale not seen since antiquity, with foreign mining companies reopening ancient pits using modern drilling and processing equipment, Extracting ore the Romans themselves had judged too poor to bother with. By the mid-1920s, mining had become the single most important industrial sector in the entire Cypriot economy, employing thousands of workers descending into shafts that in some cases opened directly into tunnels first cut by Bronze Age hands 3,000 years earlier. Today, Cyprus is not a major global copper producer. After roughly 6,000 years of continuous, overlapping extraction, Bronze Age smiths, Roman contractors, and 20th century industrial operations all working the same mountain range in successive waves, most of the island's richest and most accessible ore bodies have simply been exhausted. What remains is largely lower-grade material that earlier eras genuinely could not have processed profitably. Some of the old mining districts have reopened in recent years anyway, driven by higher global copper prices and technology capable of extracting economic value from ore too poor for any earlier era to bother with, including reprocessing the ancient slag heaps themselves for the residual traces of copper left behind by furnaces that went cold millennia ago. The mountain that once armed the Bronze Age world is now, mostly, a landscape of ancient scars, vast rust-colored slag heaps stretching for kilometers, collapsed shaft entrances hidden in the scrub, and the occasional archaeological team carefully excavating a 3,000-year-old furnace floor a few meters from an active, modern mining lease. What Cyprus never lost, though, is the word. Every time someone anywhere in the English-speaking world says copper wire or copper pipe or reaches into their pocket for a copper coin, they are, without knowing it, saying the name of a small Mediterranean island that once supplied the metal that armed pharaohs, fed the diplomatic correspondence of Bronze Age kings, and briefly sat at the absolute center of the ancient world's economy. Empires forgot the island's kings. Wars erased its Bronze Age palaces. Languages changed beyond recognition. But somewhere in the deep grammar of half the world's major languages, Cyprus is still there, embedded in a word so common that almost no one who uses it has any idea they are naming an island at all. That is a strange, quiet kind of immortality. Not a monument, not a ruin, but a metal, and the name it never let go of.